Okay, so Liam, I wanted to ask a question I think everyone wants to know the answer to right now. Is SEO dead?
It's a great question and a great starting point for this episode, throwing it right in at the deep end. My viewpoint is definitely not. I think, the way that some people will interpret the change in SERPs, AI overviews, several other AI channels, TikTok, all those things, they might make a caveat that traditional SEO, so through Google search and Bing or any other channel like that, is dead. But for me, it actually opens up more opportunities. It means that there are different SERP features to attack, different ways that Google and other search engines are displaying results. And it also allows us to tie in those other channels like your TikToks, your search GPTs, etc. of the world to start thinking about how can we get maximum exposure for our brands. So definitely not dead. Has it changed? Yes. And will it continue to change? Yes. But if we think about where SEO was 20 years ago versus where it is now, I'd argue that it's changed just as much, potentially, if not more than what it may change in the next few years.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of changes, and I think that that's quite intimidating for a lot of people. And it's hard for them to keep up. And I think that's why the program that you run is pretty cool. I found it interesting, at least. So why don't we move on to that? Can you explain what the Ignite program is specifically? Who it's for, how does it help them, how does it help them build a foundation? And yeah, can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So, I come from an agency called Blue Array. We're UK based, based out of Reading. We've been going for around 10 years or so now. And originally, when we started, our founder, Simon, he was starting as a freelancer that scaled into the agency sort of space. So he was quite often going up to startup hubs, to accelerator programs where people were looking for that sort of foundational growth. So we originally started specifically working with startups and scale ups. And then as we transitioned as an agency and got bigger in terms of headcount and the clients that we were working with, we kind of moved away from that approach and working with those kind of companies. But over the last 2 years or so now, we've since reintroduced a program specifically for startup and scale-ups, which is called Ignite. And essentially, Blu-ray Ignite is offering an entry point for startups and scale-ups that is more affordable. It comes on a 12-month program, and it really allows us to drill down on the foundational side of SEO with them. So typically, but not always, they'll come to us and they'll have maybe a few transactionally driven pages that are generating money for them, a blog that needs a bit of work from a structural standpoint, potentially lots of content gaps, and they're really starting to build those foundations to start competing for head terms, bigger keywords, and increase their market share in their relevant industries. So it's a really good and fun opportunity for us to work with them as they go through that first real growth stage of hiring an agency or someone to work on SEO full time, and really ramp up those SEO efforts over that period. So yeah, in terms of who it's for, ideally we like to start with startups and scale ups that have maybe gone through funding, have an implementer internally, so someone who is there that can make decisions, whether that be on content or tech implementation and things like that. But ultimately, sites that are looking for that next stage of growth.
Okay, cool. And in the program, like all of these changes we've spoke about, if someone's feeling intimidated by it, is the program, will you share advice and tips and all these changes in the program, or is it like your very foundational stuff, like keyword strategies, etc.?
I think it's a bit of both. I think naturally with startup and scale-up SEO strategies and tactics, you will dive into your typical keyword research, competitor analysis. Then towards the back end, naturally move on to things like internal linking and the more creative elements of SEO that allow you to do some really cool stuff. So that foundation is definitely there and doesn't change too heavily depending on the nature of the site and whether they are maybe e-commerce or marketplace versus B2B or SaaS. But then in terms of the educational piece and ensuring that we're future-proofing strategy, that definitely feeds into it. So things like how we are structuring content, how we're pulling in EAT signals, all of those kind of additional factors that contribute to maybe how SERPs and the way that people are searching is changing. Even to an extent, things like bringing in short form video into blog content or transactional pages when appropriate. Those wider elements of UX and on-page considerations are definitely things that we'll try and educate clients with, both in Ignite and just in our general sort of client stacks.
Yeah, that's very cool. Across like all of the companies that you've got in the Ignite program, so you mentioned they should have an implementer and stuff. Have you noticed any common traits or behaviors or attitudes that distinguish the most successful people in the Ignite program to the ones who maybe struggle a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. I think the most obvious one, and it's not necessarily an SEO sort of adoption piece. It's just comes back to implementation, and that's probably the case for most clients that agencies work with, regardless of size. But particularly with our Ignite clients, we tend to find that we're working with more generalist marketers, so generalists who are maybe marketing leads, head of marketing, content marketers, or whatever that title might be, and they usually spin in a few plates. So they might have SEO content, potentially digital PR, other product-based elements of their roles, and ultimately SEO, as much as we'd like it to be an easy, quick process, it does take that time and commitment for all companies to invest in it. So if we find that a roadmap is continually implemented on a monthly basis and kept up to date, chances are they're going to see a lot more success versus a company that knows that they need SEO and might commit to it, but then it's there and they think it's just because we've got an agency or a consultant, it's all going to click into place and happen overnight. And if that roadmap slides 2, 3, 4 months out of place, then suddenly everyone's playing catch up, and there's maybe some feelings that their investment isn't achieving what it's supposed to be. So I would definitely say that implementation is a big one, and that also feeds into the reporting element of it. And certain companies expecting results really quickly because they're a startup and they've got pressure from investors or co-founders, founders, that they have to put money towards every single investment that they make, which is fair because ultimately they're working on tighter and smaller budgets. But we know that there are certain elements and factors of SEO, whether it be informational content or the UX element of it, that quite often some of the things you do aren't always necessarily able to transition into like monetary evidence or conversions. But we know that the overall impact collectively has that bigger benefit when it comes to revenue.
Yeah. I think a lot of what you do as well, it can complement other channels, and sometimes it's just about maybe reframing it. Have you found any cases where I don't know, the startup has taken some content that they've done for SEO purposes, but spun it to maybe a LinkedIn post to get more mileage out of it? Have you found that that's a distraction at this point, or something that you would recommend if they do have the bandwidth?
Yeah, I definitely would recommend it. I think there's lots of value in spinning it out into different channels. Things like leveraging video content, podcasts, interviews, turning it into LinkedIn posts or social posts. Newsletters is a big one, I think, with startups where they're trying to promote their services through an email newsletter. By all means, I think it's worth doing that, but it does come back to time and effort and
Okay.
resource. So if you find that maybe 1 or 2 channels are working, so maybe it's SEO and your newsletter, then at least in the beginning, while you maybe have limited headcount, stick to those and really focus and dial down on those until you're really confident and in a place that they're working, rather than trying to sell yourselves too thinly across 5, 6 different channels where you're not really sure which is the best one. And I think that also ties in quite nicely with customer research and customer feedback. So try and figure it out where it is that your customers enjoy getting content from you the most, and leverage that as much as possible. It might not always be the channel that you think it could be coming from.
Okay, cool. What would you say the biggest misconceptions that these companies have when they come to you and they try and start SEO? Is there anything that stands out?
I think the biggest one, and rightfully so, the biggest challenge that we have in terms of onboarding or getting that signature over the line is it always naturally falls back to targets and forecasting. And that's probably the case for most agencies as well, regardless of whether you're working with startups or just enterprise or any kind of client, is the expectation that if we spend this amount of money, then we want X amount specifically to return on that. And I think it's a really difficult topic for people in our industry, because we know that ultimately we have to show that return on investment, but at the same time, there's not really a full guarantee that I can sit here and say 110% this is going to happen for you, which puts a little bit of pressure on things when you have a startup saying, you know, I've only got 50 grand or 100 grand or whatever that amount is to spend this year, and I'm going to spend 30-50% of that on SEO because I'm sold into the opportunity that exists, but I have to be 100% confident that this is what I'm going to get out of it. So I do feel like that is an interesting dynamic that I often have to balance when chatting to startups in terms of the opportunity at play. And those that understand the value long term of SEO and what it's going to offer them usually perform the best, because then when we are in month 1, 2, or 3, they're not constantly saying, how are we doing? Why are we only 3% above target instead of 2? Or why is this keyword dropped from position 6 to 6.5? And really getting into the fine tunes of the very specifics. So those that look a little bit broader and wider in terms of the impact that we're having often end up seeing the longer term relationship building and success on the back of it. Otherwise, we find that we're sort of caught up in the ad hoc emails and day to day, which slows us down versus really pushing that that strategy to work for the longer term, if that all makes sense.
No, it does for sure. Yeah, I think in the beginning as well, there's so much that you need to do to get the ball moving, and if you don't do it, it can really slow you down. I know a lot of agencies struggle, or some anyway, with communicating that to clients who want quicker results. How do you balance? So let's say a company comes to you and they're curious if this is the right thing for them. You know, maybe someone else in the company is suggesting, no, we should do PPC. That's going to bring in results now. You know, SEO is more of a longer term thing. How would you, I guess, what advice would you give to that person to help them make their decision that SEO might be the right move for them?
Yeah, for sure. I think when it comes to sales and auditing a site and looking at, you know, what that big picture opportunity is, I don't necessarily think there's a right or wrong answer, but for me as a marketer rather than a salesperson, I tend to take the opportunity from a marketing standpoint and run with that. So I think first of all, I usually typically look at competitors, but both inspirational competitors, but also competitors maybe at a similar size, maybe that are slightly further afield if there's no direct competitors in that space, to really try and understand what it is that they're doing, how they're performing, using tools like Systrix, SEMrush to demonstrate that actually there is an opportunity here to capture traffic in this market. And then also I try and envision or picture like what the final output is. So I think a lot of people think of SEO and they just assume that, you know, the short and narrow of SEO is that I'm going to create a bit of blog content and get a few clicks to my site, and it might lead to some conversions. But actually, when you dive under the hood of startup SEO, it actually becomes a lot broader than that. So you start looking at transactional pages, you start looking at guides, comparison pages with, you know, maybe industry competitors. You bring in that EEAT element of things, maybe some cost guides or some additional supporting material that allow them or educate them, their customers on what it is that you're actually trying to offer them. So as well as SEO, it almost becomes website optimization rather than just search engine optimization. And a customer that lands on their sites is going to get a much more satisfying experience, rather than us just saying, you know what, we've got this average site, but we're going to go all in on content, and users are going to get here and potentially they'll convert, potentially they won't. So yeah, I think educating them that startup SEO is much broader than just creating a bit of content that is relevant to our users, is a really nice place to start and set their expectations in terms of what we'll be looking at and what the end goal is.
Cool. Yeah, very cool. There'll obviously be companies that just aren't ready for the Ignite program yet. Maybe the market manager realizes that they already have too many plates spinning, but they want to chip away at it over the next year before they're finally ready to come on and give this the time and energy that it needs. Are there any, like, if you were to think of like a few things in particular that they should do to prepare to join the Ignite program? Is there anything, or are you looking at people to? Are you looking at more of the business? Is the business ready? Is it got a certain headcount? Is it doing a certain number? Yeah, who is the perfect candidate? And the people that aren't perfect, what should they be doing in the meantime?
Yeah, good question. I think there's naturally some flexibility there, depending on where the companies are, what industry they're in, and all that kind of stuff. In terms of perfect candidate, I think, again, touching on that implementer, you've got someone who is there and able to make decisions. So, for example, if we're creating content, you have a person that has the authority to say, yes, this sounds like a good idea. No, we shouldn't be doing this. And typically that's someone who's not the co-founder or the founder, because we know that they're extremely busy people. They don't have the ability to commit and sit down to marketing as a channel, and SEO specifically, for a large percentage of their working week. So having that additional hire of a senior marketer or a marketing manager, being in position and being settled, is definitely a good starting point. And then from a budgeting standpoint, a company that's able to be able to potentially produce content, maybe has a retainer on a web developer who is able to go in and make changes from a technical standpoint, rather than, again, someone maybe owning a site and doing everything themselves from sales to marketing to tech and website changes across the board. And then I think in terms of companies that aren't quite ready, there are various things that they can do. I think first of all is just to think about and take a step back and look at your website and say, does this website offer value to someone that lands on it for the very first time? I think a lot of sites, we might come on to this later, but a lot of sites that are in the startup world ultimately are there to try and make money, and that money doesn't always necessarily come in the form of transactional revenue from customers. It can also be through acquisition or being sold to a bigger company in your industry, and that often is the natural goal of a lot of startup founders. But the downside of that from an SEO standpoint is that a lot of startup sites that I audit or provide office hours to is you go on them and you quickly realize that the language on the site is more targeted towards acquisition than it is to a customer who might actually be interested in buying this product. And to me, that causes a bit of a conflict of interest, because you've got this founder who wants to sell a company, and they're speaking to the potential buyers of their company. But if they'd actually speak to the potential buyers of their product rather than the buyers of the company, then they could get market fit a lot quicker, and they could demonstrate to those potential buyers that, hey, we have a product that people care about, and they're actually buying, which can speed up that process significantly. Someone on the opposite side of that might say the complete opposite opinion to me. Someone on the, who's working at an investment firm, for example, but that's one opinion that I confidently stand behind from an SEO point of view. So I think, reviewing the language on your site, making sure that it's really clear that your products or services are easy to find, are separated, they're not stuffed into a homepage or all on one page, and then starting to think about how actually people can find you. So developing your site so it moves away from being a 1 to 5 page sort of holding area or landing page to an actual functioning site that's starting to grow and scale. And when you've started to get a feel for that traffic that you can generate, that's a good time to then start thinking about additional support so that you can push to that next step.
Cool. Very cool. Okay, you mentioned content there, so I wanna touch on that a little bit. Why don't we start by talking about yeah, what sort of advice would you give these companies who they really need to produce good content? It's not just about creating, every blog under the sun. If you can pick the right blogs, you'll have more bang for your buck, right? So to do that, you need to know your target market really, really well. What advice do you typically give startups when it comes to gathering that information and figuring out, what does your audience want to read and want to see? Yeah, what sort of advice would you have around that?
Yeah, good question. I think, as you touched on, personas is a really good one. Having a bit of a reflection on what it is what it is you sell and who the target audience is, and bearing in mind that your audience online might not necessarily be the same as the audience on other channels. For example, if you're an e-commerce shop that's building revenue through footfall, that might not be the same audience as the audience you target through SEO. But it's a good place to start in terms of figuring out who it is that you're actually trying to sell to, and then start to think about the different places that they look at online. So is it that they go through Google? Is it that they use AI? Do they use TikTok, other search and other social media channels? Whatever that might be. And then a good one is to use hashtags, look at what's trending, all that kind of stuff, and then form a little bit of a strategy around what are the types of content that people are looking for. And then you can go from there and work out what the intent of that is, how to best position that content on our site or on our channels. So that's more of an exploratory option, and there are plenty of places that you can look for all of that information. And then I guess a more traditional SEO answer is using keyword research tools, conducting things like a keyword gap analysis. So using a platform like SEMrush or Ahrefs, throwing all of your competitors in there and exporting their keyword data. You can do things like filter that for different queries, different URLs, subfolders, or search volumes, and then throwing that all into essentially a Google Sheet or Excel document, and conducting a gap with all of the keywords that you're ranking for, by looking at what they're ranking for and you're not. So that's a really effective one from a blog content standpoint, that you can dive into. And we like to do that at both an informational and a transactional level. So looking at, actually, are we missing any transactional pages? So a good example there would be maybe if you're a breakdown cover provider and you've only got a page for breakdown cover, but your competitors have maybe family breakdown, at home breakdown, European breakdown. Instantly there's an opportunity there where they've got more coverage than you. And then at the informational level, it'd be looking at those queries like, what to do when you break down overseas and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think two very different places there that you could look at to explore opportunities, and there are plenty of keyword research tools out there, varying in price point, from an SEO standpoint, that users could look at.
Do you find that these startups get, they've maybe just found SEMrush and they're looking at their competitors and you see all these keywords? Do you find that they typically get carried away with that and then, want to produce like so many pages when they maybe don't need to?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's human nature to see like some of those core seed keywords in your industry and think, oh, the goal is to rank for this. And absolutely it should be, but that obviously should be a process that happens over several phases, which typically starts with focusing on long tail, focusing on a specific sector or subcategory within that, and building up. And there's a whole other extra level which we haven't covered, which I'm not sure if we have time for, and that's digital PR and building that authority of a startup site that probably doesn't have that many links or that much authority. So there are lots of different considerations, and yeah, they do sometimes get carried away and get caught up in, how they're ranking daily or even hourly and how that changes. But also that one specific gold keyword that they want to maybe rank for at a vanity level. So I think it is just around education and setting expectations, but ideally that's done at the start of the conversation, rather than 3-6 months down the line after you've potentially guaranteed it and or said that, yeah, it's something that we can work towards.
Yeah, yeah. You did mention digital PR, and I think we will touch on it in a minute. I do have a few more questions on keywords. The first one, what do you think of zero volume keywords? So keywords with no volume on, like SEMrush or Ahrefs.
I think they are 100% worth looking at. There are a bunch of different ways that you can find zero volume terms, both of those tools. You can even leverage things like Also Asked. I'm sure that's potentially been mentioned in conversations that you've had in the past. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of value in them. I'd also check out Reddit, other forums to look at what people are talking about. And just because it has zero search volume doesn't necessarily mean that it's not relevant. I think a good way of describing that is SEMrush and those tools often take an annual average as well. So if the average is saying 50, it could well be that during the autumn budget release that number rises to 200 or 250, or during Christmas or a specific holiday those numbers can often quite quickly scale. And also, given the size of a lot of large scale competitors, chances are that they're not probably putting a lot of effort into zero volume or low search volume keywords. They're going after the big ones, and they're just capturing the smaller terms within those big broader articles or pages that they're releasing. So yeah, I definitely think it's a great starting point. I think a good benchmark is to take some keywords that maybe have a little bit more search volume, to give you that bit of protection, but spreading that out with your longer tail low volume or zero volume terms is a good initial strategy for you to figure out what's ranking, how Google and other search engines are determining what you site, how good your site is, and what your expertise are, and then that gives you the platform to work out and scale out from there.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I would completely agree. Yeah, don't just go and do all of zero volume or keywords. But no, great answer. So off of that, right now, I think people are starting to use longer and longer queries. I think as they become more accustomed to ChatGPT and other apps, I think people are using like 5, 6, 7 word queries. I know I'm personally typing in completely different like I've noticed myself typing sentences now, which is, it's interesting. And I've seen a few other SEOs post about this too. Curious on, what's your take on this? How do you think it's going to change?
Yeah, I think AI and ChatGPT in particular definitely have made our searches a little bit more informational and conversationally based. For me, I think it's actually a good thing based on some experience in industries like insurance, for example. I found that actually, click-through rate and conversions for a generic term like insurance are much lower than if someone was to search for something specific like home insurance for over 60s, for example. So we often quite see those terms that are those big, 500,000 millions search terms. And we think, we've got to have this could be life-changing. But actually, if there's maybe a query that's 3, 4, 5 words that has 50 to 100,000 searches underneath that, it can actually be the one that performs a lot better in terms of conversions, because the intent's there, people know exactly what they're looking for. And when you search for something that's more of a head term, you tend to find that there are aggregators, there are more SERP features, there are people that are just searching for insurance but might want car insurance, home insurance, travel insurance. They don't really know what they want, or they're just learning what a term is and want to read up a little bit more information about it. So I actually think that the longer the query, the more likely it is that you're going to get someone on your site that's more engaged and is looking for exactly the product or service that you have that's on offer. And that's not to say that it's, brand awareness and going for those big terms isn't a good thing, because it absolutely is. But I think people will start to potentially search in more detail, and that's a good thing for users that have specific products or services. And I guess to just wrap up this answer, you tend to find in the startup and scale ups, at least the ones that I've worked with, is they tend to have a product or a service that is slightly different, and potentially the challenge that they've got is they don't know how to sell it because it's in an industry that is still fairly new, and they're trying to figure out different ways of getting to their consumers. So those longer tail queries should, in theory, actually help startups and scale ups to attract customers, because users are searching for things that they might already offer.
Interesting. Very cool. Okay, why don't we move on to the actual production of the content? So, I think when it comes to just smaller teams in general, they juggle multiple roles, shifting, you're wearing different hats, and shifting into that mindset of a content creator can sometimes be challenging. Do you have any advice to maybe those marketing managers that are juggling multiple roles? Do you have any advice on how they can create high quality content whilst managing everything else?
Yeah, I think for me, the big one is there are a few different elements of it. I think the first one is get the logistics right. So make sure that there is one specific person that essentially has the authority to sign off on content. You don't want people left, right, and center saying, let's do this, let's do that. And then all of a sudden you end up with a giant list or an output of content where it doesn't flow and it doesn't make sense, and it's potentially all hosted in the same place, but you've got a sales manager over here talking about a new product feature that no one cares about. You've got a founder over on the other side talking about I don't know, a very niche award or a very niche sort of piece of information that they're sharing, and then right in the middle you've got a piece of SEO content that's like how you should do this with this, and it's like these three things have no overlap with each other whatsoever, and it's a very broken sort of experience for the consumer. So think about it from a resourcing standpoint, how you can make sure that you're consistent. Think about the cost of tools, whether you need external support, and whether that's actually going to benefit you and offset the cost of those tools. But then when it comes to the strategy itself, I think the easiest thing to forget is that the job, especially from an SEO standpoint, the job doesn't end when you've finished that last word, when you've created the article. Like, there are several other factors that need to be considered after that. So rather than saying, in this month we're going to produce 50 articles, actually produce 10 or 20 and really make sure that that entire funnel of steps to take is completed all the way through. And what I mean by that from the post-action side of things is, first one is internal linking. Quite often we see that people will produce content. They'll maybe add a few links from the content that they've written, but then they're not linking to that content from elsewhere on the site. So it's important, particularly for startups, from an indexation standpoint, so that their new pages become visible, they get indexed, and they start to see traffic. That internal linking is a major factor into that, and they have a robust strategy around it. Second one is navigation and categorization. So kind of feeds into that earlier point, making sure that you've got a structure of where you put in things. Is it going in a blog that's using tags? Are you separating company news with SEO content? Those kind of things. Making sure that you're handling pagination correctly, and then also, I guess, post that is making sure that you understand how the content is performing 1, 3, 6, 12 months down the line. I think plenty of times in the past I've been part of a content structure or strategy or team or however you want to label it, and we fall into the trap of throwing 100 articles live and not really reporting on it in the way that we should do, from a conversion standpoint, looking at where users are going after they've fallen on that page, looking at the pages that performed best and poorly, and they just kind of get swept up and added into a collective blog performance overview, when actually you should be looking at them a bit more granularly as part of that structure. So yeah, I thought I'd focus on some of the more unique and wider actions of content creation, as opposed to just saying, create a template look at keyword research, which is probably the more traditional answer. But we can definitely dive into that if you want to as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that one thing I've noticed over the past few years, especially since we launched our editing services, when you're producing content, it can either be an asset, but more often than not, with the way that people produce the content, it's a liability. Because like you mentioned, trying to do like 50 blog posts in the first month, like you start to your eye for detail or your bar for quality sort of declines very quickly when you produce that much. And I wondered if you've maybe worked with a client who has, got really excited, started to produce content, and maybe you've spotted that decline quite quickly. You also mentioned there about, how is it going to perform after 6 months? Like, more often than not as well, you need to update it. You have to refresh it. And people don't do that. They produce too much and they don't have the bandwidth to update it, to keep it, fresh. Has there been a point where you've maybe stopped someone in their tracks and said, look, we need to just slow down here. Like, this is going to cause you more trouble than it's worth. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily had that conversation directly in a sense that we're 6 months in and I've said, let's put everything on hold. But one thing that we like to do as an agency, and we do it through the Ignite program, is we essentially run page quality audits. So it sounds fancier than it actually is, but it's essentially running a crawl of the entire site through Screaming Frog or another platform, pulling every URL that exists, and I'm really going through the site with a fine-tooth comb and saying, should we keep this page? Should we optimize it? Should we remove it? Should we consolidate it with another page? Is there something else, redirect it, whatever that might be, to make sure that we've got a site where we feel confident that every page on it has a purpose and is performing well. And quite often, if you've never done that exercise before, particularly with a new client, you'll start to find a lot of thin pages that were targeting maybe a Christmas sale from 2017, a lot of pages that they don't even know exist and they've completely forgotten about, that are ultimately offering limited to no value, and potentially pulling down the overall quality of the site down. So I think that's something that's always worth revisiting every 12 months or so, depending on the size of a website. And that really allows us to find pieces of content that potentially have got a lot of low-hanging fruit or opportunity to be revamped and improved. But then you've sort of goldmine content should be revisited more frequently than that. I think at a transactional level, you should be reviewing those pages very frequently, every couple of months, and your informational content that is performing well, like we're coming back to that every quarter or so and seeing, is there anything that we can change? Otherwise, competitors are going to jump in there at some point and try and do better.
Okay, cool. So yeah, for the core PCs, it's quarterly, you said?
Yeah, I think it obviously depends on how much competition there is and the keywords that you rank for, but I would say, yeah, transactional pages, definitely monthly to every couple of months, and then quarterly or so for those really high value informational blog content pieces.
Okay, cool. Okay, here's the big question. What are your thoughts on AI content production?
It's a hard one to summarize, I think. From my view, we've got clients that do use AI to produce content, and we've got clients that have never done it. So, somewhat on the middle of the fence. And they've seen both. I've seen it where both have seen results. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that if you are producing content through AI and you're not giving it brand guidelines, feedback, going through sort of editing rounds with the AI bot itself, then you are always going to run the risk of having content that sounds a little bit like everyone else in the industry. So if you, depending on the industry and your time, resources, and budget, if that's the only solution for you, if you're doing it smart and effectively, then I would say go for it, but take caution. but nothing can quite compete with that personalized conversation that a human can have, particularly if you're talking about products or services that are physical and they can share those experiences with an audience in their own language. So yeah, I'm not totally against it, but I think you do have to tread with some caution and at least put the time and effort in to create some custom guidelines and have it produce an article for you or an output and get it to tweak it and fine tune it until it's at a place where you're happy with it.
Mm. Yeah, I think everyone thinks that I run a SEO human content company. I think everybody thinks that I'm like anti-AI. And imagine no, I think AI is great. I think you can use AI to produce content. I think the problem comes in when humans start being humans and they don't have the discipline to, go through the content again. I think when you can type in a few prompts and click a few buttons, and it's really, really easy to produce content, you produce more, but it's very easy for the ball to slip, and I see that way too often. And I think that's like the biggest value that my company brings when people buy content from us. It's that professional oversight. It's making sure that nothing is missed and that we are, thinking of every angle. And often it's not just, AI content can produce something that sounds good if you prompt it right. But it's not just about putting words on a page, it's about how it's structured, the rhythm of the page. Are you saying too much one thing and not enough of another? You really need a good human eye to do that. And that's my gripe with AI. It's not AI itself, it's who's using it. So I'm always interested in seeing other talented SEOs' point of view and how they use it. Yeah, it's interesting times for content production.
Yeah, for sure. And there's always people really on one side or the other in terms of their views. But I think we've seen several case studies of people that are completely running AI sites and they've seen success. Whether that's continued in the long run is a sort of a secondary question, but agree. Like if you use an AI to your advantage and you've got prompts that work for you, there's no reason why you can't leverage that and then potentially weave in some EAT around that. So actually, spend some time to write maybe one paragraph out of the entire article yourself that talks about your personal opinion on a subject or something that helps you build that authority. And that's not me saying just use an author bio to put a human behind it. Like actually make sure that what you're saying is true. But I think there's loads of stuff that we can do with content from an AI standpoint that helps startups in particular from a time and resource standpoint.
Mm. Yeah, I think sometimes as well with AI, it can say stuff that seems true, and you glance over it and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. Like the other day, for example, so I use AI to help me do the company newsletters. I write all the company newsletters myself, and I do leverage AI for it. And we do stuff for SEO content and only stuff for SEO content. I mean, if someone comes to us and asks us for other tools, then we'll use that. But I had never mentioned ClearScope, but the output was that we do clear scope optimized content. I was like, I don't do that. I've never told you that I do that. So I don't know where it got that from, but that's just like an example of like where I think it can trip people up really easily. But yeah, I think it's great for things like newsletters and stuff. Okay, I want to shift the conversation slightly. One mistake that I've saw people do like quite a lot actually is the person is doing the keyword research and the briefs. They don't look at it closely enough, and then when the writer does, and they actually open it up and you see the search intent can sometimes be quite different. And then they'll go and write it, and the what the person who produced the brief asked for is very different to what the content looks like in the end. And it's because the person is doing the brief for the keyword research, they're not looking at it closely enough. And then the output often ends up just completely different. So then you have to edit it or fix it or whatever. But I wondered if you had any advice around that. Like if you have decided that you want to produce content on this piece, you've decided that, this keyword is is going to bring, value to the business, and that we want to spend budget here. But how do you ensure that the output, the person that's writing the content, whether it's AI, whether it's a freelancer or another agency, how do you ensure that you're getting something of value? I guess you're getting something that is what you asked for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it's something that over my 3.5, 4 years at Blu-ray, I've definitely bumped into a few times where we've had a client that is a content-heavy client, and maybe he's getting 25 plus content templates per month, whether that's going to their writers or we're supporting them on the writing services. And I've seen my fair share of rejected content templates or articles that have come back and followed a template structure, but then don't quite make sense for a client. So I do think it is quite a tough process to nail down, and there is value in having a content workshop or an expectations meeting in terms of how many amends am I allowed, what is the process for when someone signs a template, does it need to be approved by someone, or can it go straight to writers, and all of those considerations. And that ultimately makes it easier for the content agency or the SEO agency, but fundamentally it saves time for everyone. So we're not wasting time on ad hoc time, we're not reviewing stuff 2, 3, 4 more times than necessary. And I think it just comes back to that content template structure and really nailing down what you want in there. So a few things that I think are critical. One is the intent part. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? Like, instead of just saying the intent is informational, like tell the writer what it is that you want them to solve. Maybe it's a question or something on the page. And then also providing SERP analysis. And obviously we don't always want to follow competitors directly, but if you are trying to rank for, I don't know, like how to take out a mortgage, like chances are the top 3 results are going to significantly match the intent and what Google expects from pages for that query. So share those with the writer and say, here are 3 pages that are performing significantly well for this keyword or this keyword cluster. And then I like to try and break it down on a H1 and a H2 level, which is probably what most content templates and writers will do, but I think it adds that extra structure. But then I think it's important to sort of give writers that little bit of extra flexibility to do what they want and go with it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I agree. I think just sometimes even when you're working with writers, like I'm always amazed at how many writers don't understand search intent. So our recruitment funnel, only like 1% actually passes it. So when you're working with sites that have less authority and they're competing against companies with massive resources, what strategies do you have to level the playing field?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are multiple ways to sort of approach it. First one is the content that you produce in. So if you're not able to compete for those head terms, like we spoke about earlier, looking at low search volume terms and 0 search volume terms, I'm really trying to make sure that there's post-launch tactics are on point. So internal linking, schema, content structure, and all those kind of things. But then I think backlinks and digital PR does come into it, and this is where it can be a little bit tricky for startups, especially if they're trying to justify the costs of a digital PR agency, a content agency, and an SEO agency. Maybe it is integrated, but all of those services do naturally add up. But there is a lot of value, particularly for startups, in investing in digital PR. That could be a full-scale agency, or it could be just thinking of different ways that they can execute that themselves. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your traditional digital PR campaigns of creating a story, going out to press, and really, going in with a really big plan. It can just be things like founder PR. So if you're a founder of a startup, sharing your journey, asking potentially your accelerator program or your VC network to link to your site or do interviews or features, things like that. So there are lots of different ways that you can get exposure and build that authority. through digital PR. I think it's just learning how to navigate that and educating founders that digital PR and every link that you get, assuming that it's from a relevant and quality site, is going to make an effort and have an impact. Because quite often we see that they just don't understand or aren't aware that if they get links from wider sites, that actually it's benefiting their SEO and their brand strategy in the longer run.
Cool. Okay, awesome. That's great. Okay, so that's our time today. Is there anything you want the audience to know about the Ignite program or you? Where can people reach out?
Best place to probably reach out is LinkedIn. You can find me on there under Liam Quinn. And in terms of the Ignite program, if it is something that you're interested in, do feel free to reach out. Always happy to have office hours sessions or a quick chat with startup founders. And if it's not the right time at the moment, still worth reaching out for a chat. Maybe it is in the future and we can circle back.
Very cool. Okay, Liam, this was fun. Thank you so much for this. Yeah, you dropped some real knowledge bombs today, so thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the invite, Craig.
Cool.